Chapter 2. I had fallen asleep in a chair beside Mother's bed. She didn't wake up very often and ate extremely little. I awoke. It was so dark in the room I couldn't tell if it was still daylight outside. There was a slight movement from the bed and I understood why I had woken. Mother had finally stirred. I jerked the little cord by the bed to ring for a servant and then knelt beside the bed, taking her hand in mine. Words failed me. "Elisabeth," she whispered, "my darling girl." It took all my self-control to stop the tears from surging up. "Mamma," was all I managed to croak in a hoarse whisper. "You shouldn't have come. It's too dangerous. They will get to you too if you stay here. You must leave," she whispered, terror lining her tone. She clutched my hand so tightly it hurt. "Calm down, Mamma. I'm here now, and you shouldn't worry. I'm all right. You are the one who needs to take care and calm down." She slumped back against the pillows. "You are right. You are here now. The damage is already done, and you will probably not be safe anywhere, anyway." Mother trailed off as Emily, our maid, came in carrying a tray with soup and a lit lamp, which she placed on a small shelf beside the bed. After she had eaten, Mother regained some of her strength and was able to talk. Edward came in to check up on us, but Mother shooed him away, saying she wanted some time with me to herself. It was then she turned to me and told me what had happened. She paused often in her explanation. It cost her a lot of energy to speak so much. "I will start from the very beginning and tell you as best I can all you need to know. Neither your brother nor your father know anything about this, and it should definitely stay that way for their own safety. However, you are in danger simply because you are my daughter. So pay attention and make sure you do as I say." "Yes, Mamma," I replied dutifully. Assuring herself I had taken this to heart, she began her tale. "As you well know from the fairy tales I told you as a child, there is magic in this world we live in. Some women are able to control it. Magic is purely the domain of women among our people, although I have heard that men from other races have powers too. Among us, magic is hereditary. It is very rare for a woman with power not to pass on some of her ability to her daughter. In Vendale, the royal line has particularly strong magical blood. You know that I was born into an old, well-respected noble family. We Perels have always had quite strong magical blood in our line, and I inherited some of it. Unfortunately, not very much. It seems, as things have turned out, the magic in our bloodline has weakened. This has not only occurred in our family, for the Queen herself has a drop and only a drop of power, even though her bloodline is even stronger than my own. Now, the noble families with magical blood have always been involved in the protection of our dear kingdom, and the royal family, of course. We have the best interests of Vendale at heart, but the uses of magic are varied, and there are some women who use it for evil ends. It is now, when our magic is at its weakest, that the greatest threat to us has arisen. A group of women have plotted to take over the kingdom by magical means, using it for their own ends instead of upholding the creed we live by. Magic should be used for protection, not to cause harm. They clearly intend to hurt our crown prince. Thankfully, he is protected by the royal circle for the moment. The witches have slowly weakened my defenses and will soon take my life. There is hope, though, for as long as you survive and learn the arts of magic, you will be able to defeat them. I have seen it in true visions. I have known for some time that your inborn power is far stronger than with anyone else I have ever met. Promise me, Elisabeth, you will not let the coven weaken you. You must stay firm in your convictions. I have shown you the right path, and you must not stray from it. They will prey on your thoughts. They will prey on you if you become weak by hatred or impure thoughts. What is worse, they will not kill you as they will me. I am much older, and they were not able to turn my thoughts down their dreadful path. So they chose to rid themselves of my bothersome presence. You are young, and they will do everything possible to make you their slave. so your power will serve them. Ensure you are safe. But who will teach me? How am I supposed to learn? I asked, noticing the surge of strength wane as she sank deeper into the pillows supporting her. She whispered as she closed her lids. I have definitely taught you the basics. You just need to remember. And once you are of age, you must go to the Queen. She must see sense under the circumstances and train you, irrespective of her misgivings. Moments later, Mother's eyes flew open again. Open the drawer on the left of my dresser. There is a belt there. I have prepared it for you to protect you. Never take it off. It can only protect you while it is on you. I went over to the mahogany dresser, my fingers brushing the fine inlay work in a habit from happier times. I found the belt. It was an interesting piece. The intricate golden vine design that curled its way around the circle appeared to have grown from a plant rather than having been crafted by a metal worker. I put it on, and it fit perfectly, falling into place magically. The clasp closed with a soft click and vanished. It was only because I knew where it was that I could open it again. The belt was warm to the touch, and I felt comforted by its heavy presence, which exuded my mother's love and worry for me. I walked over to the bed again to find Mother had fallen asleep. Her breathing was ragged. I returned to my seat next to the bed and thought over what she had told me. In the days that followed, I spent all my time beside my mother's bed. She weakened even more, unable to speak and sleeping for longer and longer periods. She ate less with every passing day. Edward also spent most of each day by her side, and together we waited in silence for the inevitable, which came during the night of the fourth day. Mother's breathing had been irregular, and then the ragged gasps calmed and deepened. A great sense of peace filled the room. Calm enveloped me as I realized the end was near. I looked up at Edward, who had come to the same conclusion. He took one of her hands and I took the other, holding it until I felt the telltale creep of deathly cold. It had gone limp. I placed it on the coverlet. Complete silence invaded the room. The whole house honored death. The night and its darkness were our first mantle of mourning. I crossed over to where Edward stood, and we held each other. No words were necessary, and neither were any tears. She had suffered enough. It was a final release, and we were grateful it had come with peace. The funeral, however, was a terrible affair. The noble women wailed and shed fountains of tears, as though my mother had been a beloved sister, whose absence would cost them years to become accustomed to. In actual fact, they had ostracized her for the most part, refusing to call on her. Once they filed into the church, the gentlemen stood stoically by, faces so stern they seemed to be carved from stone. And yet I knew, despite all their efforts to seem heartbroken, they really didn't care and only awaited the great feast which would be provided after the ceremony. Father had arrived the evening before. Grumpy, he had been called away from his important work for such meaningless drivel. He seemed to be put out by Mother's death only because of its inconvenience, not at all affected by the fact his wife had died. Father had already mentioned several times how ill-timed Mother's passing was in terms of the expenses he had to make for the funeral. His indifference to her death was immeasurably hurtful. I felt sickened to my very bones having to stand beside him for the ceremony. I wished beyond anything that I could leave the church and spend the time remembering my mother, how she had been when she used to take me out into nature and tell me tales. Instead, I was forced to stand through a grueling hour and a half in the overcrowded, stuffy church and listen to the pompous, meaningless words of the priest, who rattled on about how beloved Mother had been, ignoring the fact she was left to face life alone with no support from her family or friends. Even her good deeds were ignored. The priest only focused on what a good mother she had been, overlooking the fact that my mother had been the most powerful and most active member of the royal circle, or that she helped many a poor citizen in troubled times, showing charity becoming of the church. When it finally ended, we all crowded out into the cemetery, and I noticed a throng of silent people standing beyond the church limits. They were peasants and, as such, not allowed to attend the funeral with the aristocrats. I wondered whether they were people whom Mother had helped over the years. Father and Edward led the procession ahead of the coffin, which was carried by several attendants. As a girl not yet of age, I was not allowed to lead the procession, and so I had to follow after my mother's casket. To my relief, Richard walked out behind me, forcing the remaining people to keep their distance from me for fear of breaching any of the rules of etiquette. I was a little surprised, though. As a crown prince, he was perfectly entitled to walk in front with the other two. Yet he chose to spare me from the crowd. Once the shiny casket had been returned to the womb of the earth, my family and I were expected to remain beside the mound of dirt until every single guest had paid their last respects to my mother and had given their condolences to us, in order of rank. It was telling that neither the Queen nor any of the members of the royal circle attended the funeral. I couldn't understand how the one group of friends I thought Mother had, the members of the council she worked in, were not present at her funeral. I had hoped to ask them to teach me magic, but now I wasn't sure anyone would be willing to train me. What was I going to do? How could I fulfill my mother's dying wish? After an eternity, when the grave mound had vanished under a pile of wilting flowers, the last person pressed my hand and said how sorry she was Mother had died. Finally, I could be alone with the gaping hole that consumed my innards, and which I would have to learn to live with. "Come along, Elisabeth," my father ordered when he noticed I did not turn to leave with him and Edward. I shook my head. "I would like to be alone for a bit, Father. I will join you at the house later." His face clouded over. "You are expected to entertain the guests. This is an important social event and you should be seen and behave yourself according to your station. You will come and do as you are told." Before I could argue with him, Edward raised a hand to Father's arm. "Mother has just passed on. It is a sore loss for Elisabeth, who has not spent time with Mother in many years. They were very close. It may be best for her to make her peace before she joins us at the manor." Father grunted in response, and to my relief left without saying anything else. Time passed. As I sat by Mother's grave, thinking over what she had told me that day I returned from school. I pondered how I was supposed to learn magic, for even though she claimed she'd taught me the basics, I could not remember her talking of such things in all the time we'd spent together. She told me of the animals that lived in the forest, and she always recounted beautiful tales of brave deeds or malicious people, and how the just and the good always triumphed over evil. I loved those stories more than anything else, but how could they help me now? As I sat pondering my dilemma, a story I had not found that interesting in the past resurged from the depths of my memories. I remembered how we had come across a part of the forest that had been burned, and Mother told me a tale, The Girl Who Saved Herself with Fire. It was about a girl who had magical powers but who was unaware of them. One day she had gone into the forest to pick some wildflowers in a glade, where she was set upon by evil men who captured her to sell into slavery. In her fear, when one of the men laid his hands on her, he burst into flames, and all the others ran away in terror of her power. Thus she managed to save herself through her fear, which had triggered her abilities. Could it mean that women with magical abilities could release these in situations of danger when they were very afraid? I thought back on my childhood and whether there was anything which had truly made me feel fear. None of the little fearful incidents seemed adequate. I could not invoke anything that was the essence of magical power within me from any of the memories. There was nothing there at all. Help me, Mother! How in the world was I going to learn to protect myself from the bad witches if I didn't know where to start? Another memory came to mind from the depths of my subconscious. The incident when Edward had knocked me into the deep pool of water by the river. I had been very, very small when it happened. It must have been one of my earliest recollections. My mind was flooded with details of the incident. I had toddled up to the edge of the deep pool, watching a dragonfly perched on a rock right at the edge of the water. The boys were rushing around trying to catch some insect, but when they became aware of my interest in the dragonfly, they joined me by the water's edge. Edward tried to catch the dragonfly and it flew away. I remembered looking at him, a disappointed cry crossing my lips. He nudged me and ran off laughing, Richard in tow, as my baby feet slipped on the uneven rocks. In a flash, icy water gushed onto my face. I could hear the boys laughing hysterically above me and wanted to cry, but for some reason I didn't. I was terrified. Nevertheless, that terror turned to wonder as I sank deeper and deeper into the beautiful underwater world. The plants that lined the walls of the pool took on ethereal colors in the gloomy depths. There were so many fish and other interesting creatures living in the deep pool, but I feared none of them. They were friends. The glittering sunlight shimmered strangely from that viewpoint. I was enchanted. Then, just as unexpectedly, it all vanished from sight as I was pulled upwards and out of the pool by an unforeseen savior. I couldn't remember whether it was Richard or Edward who pulled me from the water. "Elisabeth!" I was jerked from my musings. Richard approached me. It was already dusk and I had been sitting in the graveyard for over an hour. My legs were stiff and I struggled to get up. In the end, I was unable to do so before he reached me, and I had to accept his help. I was forced to lean on him as pins and needles pricked through my feet. "I'm sorry," I breathed. "I didn't notice the time." "What are you still doing out here?" I was worried. I did my best to avoid his gaze. I felt silly. How could I be so thoughtless? My legs still hurt, but I decided to start walking despite the pain. You haven't answered my question, Elisabeth. What are you doing out here alone?" His tone revealed impatience. "I just wanted to be alone for a bit to think." "To think? What about?" Now he was curious. I wanted to keep my findings to myself, knowing that if I refused to reply, though, he would never let the matter rest, so I conceded. "Silly things, really, like the day Edward knocked me into the pool by the river." He frowned and only commented after a long silence, "I do vaguely remember diving into that pool to fish you out. That was so very long ago, I hardly remember." So he was my secret rescuer after all. I had somehow hoped it was Richard and not Edward who plucked me from the deep. We reached his horse beside the church entrance. A tall, buff man I had not seen before held the reins and passed them to Richard as we approached. Without a word of warning, Richard popped me onto the steed and swung himself into the saddle behind me. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Lily hurrying over. She must have been instructed to stay with me. I felt a little guilty she would now have to walk back to the short distance to the manor on her own, but I dared not insist Richard let me down again. The powerful muscles of the creature beneath me contracted, and then we were off, the clip-clop of iron-shod hooves beating fast on the hard ground. "Hold on tight, I can't risk you falling," he instructed. He was so warm. He felt so safe. His closeness overwhelmed me and made breathing hard. I felt my heart pumping and hoped he couldn't hear it. With an almost superhuman effort, I resisted snuggling closer. That would have taken things too far. Besides, he was just getting me home, nothing more. I had to be careful not to let my silly little brain overinterpret things. That could become seriously awkward. All too soon we arrived at the last bend of the drive before the house appeared. We stopped and Richard jumped off the horse. Without a word, he led me the last bit, while I sighed to myself, disappointed I couldn't remain pressed against his warm body, but knowing full well the consequences should anyone at the reception see us together in that manner. I noticed his manservant was nowhere to be seen and wondered whether he had chosen to walk back with Lily to keep her company. Laughter and boisterous talking from the house jarred the peaceful quiet of the evening. It turned my attention to my task at hand, and that father would be upset with me for having stayed out so long. As we reached the front of the house, Richard helped me dismount, handed the reins to our stable hand who loitered among the parked carriages, and then rushed me up the stairs and into the noisy house. "You should change. Your dress is stained." I wanted to thank him, but he had already entered the loud parlour and become submerged in the crowd. Another sigh escaped me as I made my way to my room. For some reason, his presence had been comforting, and I felt safe. I wanted to be near him again, away from all the bustle and merrymaking coming from downstairs. He had protected me from the people before, but now he slipped into that crowd and I would have to face the sea on my own. Lethargy took hold of me. I dressed slowly. I put off all thoughts of what was to come next. I held father's probable seething at arm's length, choosing rather to ponder my discovery about magic. I had just slipped into another black dress when a soft knock sounded at the door. Lily's muffled voice offered help from the other side. I started. If she had walked, she would have taken quite a while longer to get back. Or had I taken an eternity to change? "Oh, mistress," she breathed as she helped me button up my dress. At first I was terrified, but then being on the horse was totally breathtaking. So she had been ridden back by Richard's manservant. It was rather curious, but I didn't inquire further, my mind filled with other thoughts. When I entered the parlour, Father took notice. Fury contorted his round face, but he swallowed hard to control his anger in front of the throng of guests. Instead of shouting at me, as he often did, his hand made a pawing motion while he glanced at the visitors with his bulging eyes. I dragged my feet as I set about my duty to entertain guests, on the one day in my life when I personally didn't feel the least bit entertaining. It was an agonizing evening, having to smile and be courteous to all the people who laughed, cheered, and told terrible jokes. All I wanted was to be surrounded by silence. I longed to be alone, but the guests refused to leave. Richard also avoided me the entire time. He was so odd. First he'd been so kind and considerate, both on the day I arrived and earlier when he worried and came to fetch me. Then he refused to be seen within half a room of me, and it wasn't as though he was ignoring me or having a fun time himself. Every so often I would feel a pair of eyes boring into me, and when I looked around, I saw his lanky frame or caught his intense gaze framed by dark curls. Every single time our eyes met, he would turn and vanish before I could approach him. What was going on? I felt confused and frustrated. I had no idea what I should do. At long last, the guests began to leave, and it was only when the last one had swung their cloak into place and I noticed Richard was no longer there. After the grueling trial the evening had been, I was almost grateful he'd left without bidding me farewell. I would not have been able to remain civil with him. Father was still saying his goodbyes to that tardy visitor, and so I slipped up the stairs to my room, hoping he would not call me to answer for my delay after the funeral.